Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, I chat with BBC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal about a topic that has featured prominently in recent immigration news. In the aftermath of the unsuccessful bipartisan border deal, we're going to do a deep dive into the claim that we don't need such a deal because President Biden can use his executive power to solve the border crisis himself. Stay tuned. Immigration has been in the headlines even more than usual recently, with both concerns about border security as well as reports of the benefits of immigration for our economy featuring prominently. The border in particular has been top of Americans' minds, with a February Gallup poll finding that, for the first time since 2019, immigration is the top-ranked concern of Americans. 28% named immigration as the top problem, an 8 percentage point jump from January. Despite this, a recent bipartisan border deal failed to make it through the Senate, with former President Trump proclaiming that a bad border deal is worse than no border deal. While a few Democrats were opposed to the bill on the belief that it would remove humanitarian protections for vulnerable individuals, most of the opposition came from Republicans, who claimed that the legislation did not go far enough in addressing the needs at the US-Mexico border. Certain Republicans who were opposed to the bill emphasized that Congress doesn't need to do anything, and that it is in President Biden's power to secure the border himself. So let's do a deep dive into this claim. Theresa, firstly, can you give us a very quick 101 on the scope of executive power and the authority of Congress?
Sure. So taking a step away from immigration, going back to Civics 101, Congress and the executive branch are considered co-equal branches of our government under the Constitution. And the job of Congress is to create laws, legislation, to govern all kinds of things and how we operate as a country. And the job of the president, acting through the executive branch, the cabinet, and the departments and agencies under his control, is responsible for implementing those laws, or depending on what kind they are, a law they are, enforcing the laws. But this simplistic dynamic doesn't necessarily cover the whole scope of things. So Congress can and does, within the legislation it writes, give the president certain discretionary powers. And so these are powers that the president may or may not use in a certain area of law, such as immigration law. And it's up to the president to decide when or how they use them. Some discretion is also given to specific cabinet secretaries in the law. So sometimes it's the Secretary of Homeland Security or the Attorney General that's told they may have discretion to do certain things under the law. And then Congress will use terms like may or shall. And sometimes shall means you must, and sometimes shall means you could. And it's up to honestly, the courts frequently to decide which is which. So speaking specifically of immigration law, certain aspects of immigration law are set by Congress, and really the president can't change those, such as the categories under which somebody can apply for a green card, the annual numbers of green cards that are allowed to be given out each year in those categories. That's all set in statute, and the administration has no discretion to change or adjust those. Other things, the administration does have some discretion. So, for example, there are categories of people that are not allowed to be admitted to the United States. But law also gives the president a discretion to waive those so-called grounds of inadmissibility for certain things and in certain circumstances. Also, the statute says that if you qualify under one of these categories that Congress has given out, you are allowed to enter the country, but then it also just gives discretionary power to the president to not admit people who otherwise could be admitted if it's in the national interest. So it's not overly simplistic. It's overly simplistic to say that, Congress has said what the law is and the president must administer that law or enforce that law exactly. The other big factor here is that Congress may pass a law requiring an administration to do something, but Congress also has to give the administration the money to do that thing. The first is called an authorization, and the second is the appropriation. And very frequently, oftentimes, as a matter of fact, there is authorization to do something in law, but Congress doesn't give the appropriation or enough money to the administration to do that thing. And a very common example here in immigration is detention. So there are certain places in the statute where it says that the government must detain an immigrant in a certain circumstance. For example, someone who's subject to expedited removal for arriving between a port of entry or arriving at a port of entry without any entry documents can be subject to expedited removal. This is a process that removes them from the United States but doesn't go through immigration court. But Congress has only ever provided enough money to the government to detain about 40,000 people at one time. So anytime there's more than 40,000 people who have to be detained, the government can't detain them. And so they have to be released some way and somehow. And this is particularly true of what we've been seeing in the last several years, where far, far many more people have been arriving at the border than could be detained under our immigration system. So again, in general, Congress can tell the government, you must do something. But if it doesn't give them the money to do it, then the government has to decide exactly how to use those dollars and what to use them to do if it can't meet all of the things that Congress has told it to do. And so, again, even though it sounds simplistic, in reality, it may or may not be possible for an administration to do things on its own.
So clearly, we need more money and more resources towards this problem. What would that actually do? Why do we need that money?
Well, let's go back to the beginning of this Senate border bill. It started because President Biden gave a request to Congress for something called supplemental spending. When the amount Congress has allocated for a fiscal year, and our fiscal year goes from October 1st of one year to September 30th of the following year, is not enough to do the things that Congress has told the government to do, the president can go back to Congress and ask for additional money. That's called a supplemental spending package. And the president went to Congress and said, I need a supplemental spending package to fund 4 specific foreign policy, national security priorities. And those were support to Ukraine in its battle against Russia's invasion, support to Israel in its fight against Hamas, support for military activity in the South China Sea, where China is kind of encroaching upon Taiwan, and money for the border. And the money would go to additional agents, additional transportation, additional technology, and additional adjudications, money for the State Department to help countries take back people that are deported from the United States, money for the State Department to do more refugee resettlement, money for states and localities and non-governmental organizations that are processing migrants who have been released in the United States, all of that together. So when that was presented to Congress, Republicans, particularly Republicans in the House and Senate, said, well, we're not going to give the administration more money for the border unless we also get policy changes. So they wanted to see specific policy changes. And again, the House, very early this Congress in 2023, passed a bill called H.R. 2 that was its priorities for changing immigration law and how particularly asylum seekers are treated at the border. It would have demanded a reenactment of the Remain in Mexico policies. It would have allowed for summary expulsions. It would have required new repatriations to third countries, things like that. But that bill got no Democratic votes, and the president immediately said that he would veto it if it were to pass. So it was really a Republican-only bill. And generally, those kinds of bills, when they come out of the House with only one party vote, and it doesn't matter which party's in the majority, they're called in DC messaging bills because everybody knows they're never going to get enacted into law, but they represent a message from that party in the majority that that's their priorities to get things done. So when the president heard that Republicans were not going to pass this package without changes to the border policy, he said, okay, let's talk. And so Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the president, through Secretary Mayorkas and White House staff, worked with Senators Langford and Sinema and Murphy in the Senate to create this set of border policies, which, as you noted, even before it was released, President Trump had already said he didn't think that this was a bill that should pass. Republicans in the House started talking about it as if it was not something that they could ever look at because it has to be the bill they passed or nothing. And so it fell apart rather quickly. So what then started happening is this set of recriminations with Democrats in the Biden administration saying it was President Trump and Republicans who killed this bill. And Republicans, particularly in the House and particularly Speaker Johnson in the House, said, well, wait a minute, at the end of the day, you don't need authorities. You could shut down the border if you wanted. And so some of this is rhetorical. Some of this is about blaming for the fall apart of the bill. But the reality is that our existing process for treating asylum seekers at the border was last updated in 1996, at a time when the number of asylum seekers was very tiny compared to the total number of people arriving at the border, when the number of people who are not Mexican was so small that the Border Patrol only reported Mexicans and everybody else in a group. They called other than Mexicans, or OTMs. So that tells you how few non-Mexicans there were. And put simply, the process and the law as written says that anyone who arrives in US territory, arrives to or is in US territory, no matter how they arrive, including people interdicted at sea and brought to the United States, may apply for asylum. So our law makes it clear that once you are in our zone of authority, which is our territory, you are allowed to ask for asylum. It doesn't mean you get it, but it means we have to have a process and we have to allow you to make that try. And that is fundamentally why we're having such a big problem at the border, because when almost everybody who's arriving now is turning themselves into Border Patrol and saying, I want to ask for asylum, our asylum process is nowhere near the capacity to adjudicate all these cases. And that's stretching out now into years, and that's meaning more people are coming because they see it as a way to come. It doesn't mean that none of the people arriving have valid asylum claims. That is not true. But it does mean that our ability to process asylum claims at the border is completely overwhelmed right now. And so that's one of the reasons why we say, and I've said, we do need changes in our asylum policy, but we also need the resources to implement them. And Congress is going to have to do both. Like that's not something the president can on his own do. I think the other factor here is that what has consistently happened since President Obama first started dealing with unaccompanied children from Central America in 2014 is the efforts of the administrations, both Republican and Democrat, to try to change how the process works at the border have been met with litigation by opponents of those policies. Sometimes it's political opponents. So a governor of a state of the opposite party to the president is suing over particular policies. Sometimes it's immigration advocates suing over policies. Sometimes it's both at the same time. But what that has meant is that we have now dozens and dozens and dozens of cases of litigation over some of these discretionary authorities that may or may not exist in law, and over whether one of those discretionary authorities, when it conflicts with another part of law, which supersedes the other, or do we have to read them together? And this is particularly true about that asylum provision. So, I think that the challenge for any executive branch, whether it's, a President Trump or a President Biden or a President Obama, is without Congress changing the underlying law, whatever policies they put in place are likely to be challenged in court. And if challenged in court, they may be taken down or on appeal allowed to continue, and then on another appeal taken down again. And we have inconsistent policies. So I think, honestly, that the executive branch, whether it's, again, President Trump or President Biden, may be running out of room, given all this spate of court cases, to do a lot new or different on their own without Congress. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now, is that, President Biden said after the death of the Senate bill that he and his administration would be looking to shut down the border, and that they're looking at new ways to do that. But they haven't announced anything yet. The State of the Union is this evening, the date we're recording this on March 7th. Maybe he'll announce something today, but what we're hearing from the administration is that they haven't yet settled on what else they might do, that they haven't tried, or that hasn't been litigated before in court. And I think that's the struggle that people are having right now.
Yeah, Theresa, can you clear something up for me? Because you mentioned HR2 and how that would enshrine the Remain in Mexico policy and law.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, my understanding is Remain in Mexico was a Trump era executive order. So, can you just clear up for me? Is this something that is in the president's power, or? i- Yeah, I'm just slightly
Yeah.
confused here.
That's a very good question. So there is a section of immigration law that allows someone who would be subject to deportation proceedings before immigration court to wait for those hearings in contiguous territory, Mexico or Canada. It's a provision of law that really was not used very often at all. It was seen by Customs and Border Protection as kind of an accommodation for Mexicans or Canadians who wanted to challenge the fact that they weren't being admitted to the country in immigration court. And rather than wait in the United States, particularly if they'd be subject to detention, would allow them to wait basically back home. And it was used locally, but it was very rare that it was used. And so it kind of was this, I would say, arcane provision of law that nobody paid much attention to until President Trump came into office. And what his administration did was saw that and said, well, we could require this of non-Mexicans. We could require this of the Central Americans, and we could use this as a way of saying, well, you're not going to get to wait out this decision on asylum in the United States. We have to let you ask, but we don't let you have to let you wait in the United States for that. And they announced that they were going to start doing this for Central Americans. And interestingly, Mexico didn't say that they agreed to it. So international law says that countries have sovereignty over who comes into their territory. I mean, we say that all the time about we have to secure the border, and we do have sovereignty. But once somebody is in our territory, where we can send them back to depends on the other country's sovereignty. So obviously, most countries should and do take back people who are their own citizens. And Mexico would take back Mexican citizens pretty much without limit. But there's nothing that says that Mexico has to take back somebody from a different country once they've left Mexican territory. And so obviously, if they cross the border into the United States, they have left Mexican territory. And so we can't just send them back to Mexico. Mexico has to agree to take them. So when the Trump administration put forward they call it the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, or colloquial known as Remain in Mexico, Mexico very pointedly said, we don't agree to take them back, but in the interest of humanitarianism, we will allow it, which meant they were kind of coerced into doing it. But they had limits. They would only take back Spanish speakers from Central America. They wouldn't take back people from anywhere in the world. They also, they were supposed to then be responsible for the security of people who are in Mexico. But there have been widespread reports that most of the migrants, or many of the migrants who are waiting in Mexico, were subject to robbery, assault, sexual crimes, including extortion and kidnapping from government officials, as well as criminal actors in Mexico. So it was very dangerous for them. And it was very difficult to coordinate them coming back for their hearings. They wouldn't always get the notices, or they'd show up at a port of entry very early in the morning, and the port of entry didn't know they would be allowed in, and so they weren't allowed in, and they missed a hearing. Now, that may or may not have been intentional on the part of the Trump administration, but it was very difficult, and a lot of those people fell out of the process. When the Biden administration ran for office in 2020, that one of the things they said they wanted to do was end Remain in Mexico. And they did move to end it early in their tenure, but a court ordered them to keep it in place. And so then they had to keep it in place, and they had to try to negotiate with Mexico to reopen it. But Mexico said, not really. And so then the courts had to rule on whether or not the US was really trying to get Mexico to do it. In the end, that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And basically, the Supreme Court said, we can't order an administration to do something that requires a foreign government's cooperation. So the Biden administration can end Remain in Mexico. And they finally did. So one of the challenges of legislating this as a mandate rather than an option, which it is right now, it's discretionary, it's an option, is that it does require Mexico to cooperate. And for example, Mexico has said under Title 42, which was also in place during both the Trump and the Biden administration, that they would take back certain Venezuelans, for example, but only in certain limits, and only the same number that the Biden administration was able to give parole to come to the United States, so 30,000 a month. They have not agreed to take back other nationalities that are non-Spanish speaking or not from the hemisphere, like Chinese or Indians. And so this, creates challenges. And so I think one of the things that is important to understand when you hear these debates over legislation and authorities and politics is there really is an operational reality at the border, which is, we only have so many places that we can hold people at the border. And when those places are over capacity in the interest of safety and health for not just the migrants, but the people who work in those facilities, we have to release them somewhere. And if we can't release them quickly back to Mexico, and we can't transfer them to detention because we don't have enough places, or it's unaccompanied children and they have to go to Health and Human Services, or it's families and we don't have detention places for them, then what happens is that the only option left for the administration is releasing them into the country. And so, there's a reality that the process and the infrastructure and the resources have to match whatever policy it is we want to put in place. And especially if that means that it's going to require cooperation of another country, that's a foreign policy determination. And you can require the administration to try to negotiate, but our Congress has no power to order another country to do something.
So let's talk a little bit more about what Biden has done. You mentioned Biden did reverse some of the Trump era executive actions. So he did ultimately manage to end Remain in Mexico.
Mhm.
My question is, what was that a mistake? So we can't get Remain in Mexico back now because, well, Mexico's wouldn't really play ball with it. Was it a mistake to end it? Could we have just kept it in place and would it have been effective?
That's a very interesting question. One thing to understand is that by the time of the end of the Trump administration, because we were in COVID, very tiny, tiny numbers of people, like maybe a dozen or so, were newly being enrolled in Remain in Mexico. Basically, Title 42, which was put in place in March of 2020, and was used instead. It was used instead of everything. It was used instead of Remain in Mexico. It was used instead of asylum processing in front of immigration court. Basically, under Title 42, we said that because of public health, we're not going to process anybody for anything. You're just going to be turned back around, either to Mexico if they'll take you, or back to your home country. And so we expelled people to lots of countries where we could. So Remain in Mexico wasn't really a factor by the time Biden came in. There were a few thousand people that were still in Mexico. And in the beginning part of administration, he let them come into the United States to finish their processing in the US. But for the most part, the Biden administration processed everybody under Title 42 the same way Trump did. And Title 42 is actually in place longer under the Biden administration than it was under the Trump administration, because it didn't end until May of 2023. So, it's hard to say whether Remain in Mexico, if it had stayed in place, would have been continued to be a major deterrent. I think there's a lot of unknowns. We know now that Mexico has said we're not doing that again, because at the end of the day, Mexico didn't want to have all those people waiting in Mexico. And the thing about Remain in Mexico that was different than Title 42 is that they were still awaiting a decision in US courts. So they weren't going to leave northern Mexico because they had to come back to the United States for a court hearing, possibly many court hearings. And so continuation of that policy meant that Mexico would continually have large groups of migrants living in northern Mexico, subject to crime and creating problems, frankly, for some of their communities. And so Mexico didn't really want that. And so they were not likely to continue doing that. And I think that is one of the things that they would probably push back on again. It's one thing if you're sending somebody back to Mexico and essentially deporting them into Mexico, and then Mexico can choose whether to let them stay in Mexico or deport them. But under Remain in Mexico, they weren't going to leave. There was no rationale under which they would leave. And so that was not something that Mexico felt was in Mexico's interest to
Mhm.
continue. So I'm not sure how much longer Mexico would have continued. And Remain in Mexico, I talked about how Biden administration was ordered to keep it in place, but Remain in Mexico was subject to court cases against Trump to take it down that were rendered moot when the Biden administration decided it was going to end it. So again, litigation would pop up again almost immediately if any administration were to reinstate Remain in Mexico, I think. And so we'd have to see what the courts decide ultimately is the answer there. So, again, I don't think we can say that absolutely Remain in Mexico solved everything. If you look at the data at the time it was put in place, the numbers went up and down. There
Mhm.
was no sort of consistent drop. And there were other policies that were in place at the same time that MPP was in place. So it's hard to tell which, if any, of those policies accounted for any of the rising and falling of the numbers during that time.
Yeah.
So I think it's not accurate to say that, oh, Trump had it all figured out. He had solved the problem. I don't think that's accurate at all.
Yeah, and one of the challenges with Remain in Mexico is these asylum seekers, they do eventually have to come back into the United States for their court hearing.
Yeah.
So that does put pressure on the border. You haven't really solved much of the problem, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so okay, we mentioned Title 42. That is another executive action that Biden ended.
Mhm.
I guess the same question again. Was that a mistake? Could Biden have kept that in place? Would that have helped the situation?
I think it would be very difficult for Biden to keep Title 42 in place the way it was created. So, Title 42, to recap for those who haven't been listening to the podcast for a little while, is public health law for the United States. It's not immigration law. And so the order was from the director of the Centers for Disease Control. It wasn't a DHS order. And that order said that because of the spread of COVID, and there's a public health emergency in the United States because of COVID, we are saying that it is against the US interest to have migrants entering between ports of entry and put in congregate settings and a lot of other things. But basically it said, therefore we're ordering them not, we're denying them entry under this authority. And what that meant was we can't actually deny them entry because they're already crossed into our territory, but we send them right back out, expel them without any immigration process whatsoever. The challenge with keeping Title 42 and the reason it ultimately ended, and by the way, Title 42 was also litigated. Trump was sued over it and Biden was sued over it. And he also had to keep it up longer than he wanted to because the court said he couldn't take it down, all of which happened. But once the government ended the public health emergency for COVID in May of 2023, the basis on which that order existed went away. And the court agreed. They said there's no public health emergency, so Title 42 can't continue. So you could theoretically look at that authority in public health law and say there's another public health threat and put another order in place. But that existing order couldn't, since it was based on COVID, couldn't be put back in place the same way. But I think, again, the litigation then comes as to whether or not that public health rationale is sufficient to supersede our other law, our other immigration law that says people have the right to ask for asylum. So I think that's the challenge that courts would have to face. It almost certainly, again, any re-up of this might be subject to litigation. Interestingly, the Senate bipartisan bill and the new House bipartisan bill create a new authority in immigration law that would act similarly to Title 42. So this was something that was widely misunderstood, this idea that we'd let in 5,000 people and then we'd shut down the border. That's not exactly what it said at all. It said that when encounters reached 5,000, and that's not 5,000 people let in, that's the number of people who arrive that we have to manage, however we manage them, hits 5,000, an average of 5,000 over a week, then the government would have to basically use this new Title 42 like authority in immigration law, which is Title 8, to temporarily stop allowing asylum applications. We would still process everybody who arrived, but we'd process them basically for expulsion or expedited removal and not for asylum. And it could only be in place for a certain period of time. And then when the numbers went down, we could allow it again. And the idea was basically to prevent the new asylum system that the bipartisan bill would put in place from being overwhelmed. By placing that authority within immigration law, you wouldn't have that court challenge to say public health can't supersede immigration law because it's two parts of the same statute then that you'd have to read in tandem. But the law also changed that provision of law about when and how people can ask for asylum at the border. So it basically created these conditions under which in the immigration law now, you could decide whether or not somebody who arrived would be allowed to ask for asylum.
Okay, so we've discussed some of the reversals that Biden has put in place against Trump era executive actions. Let's talk a little bit about what President Biden has done in terms of his executive actions. So, what has he done or tried to do, and have these attempts been effective?
Yeah. So again, just to remind, he did keep Title 42 in place quite a long time. So he was, in total, he expelled more people under Title 42 than Trump did. But during that time period, there also saw a very large number of arrivals from places that Mexico wouldn't take back and that we couldn't deport to their own countries under Title 42, including people from Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, countries that we don't have diplomatic relations with and wouldn't take back their nationals, even if we were to try to deport them there, and Haiti, which at the moment has no functioning government. So we did deport under Title 42. We did send people back to Haiti for quite some time, and then before we started finding other ways of letting them in. But Biden also changed some regulations as to how asylum seekers were processed at the border. He created a process whereby migrants arriving who asked for asylum would get a rapid hearing before an asylum officer. And if they met that initial screening, the asylum officer could grant their asylum without having to go to immigration court. But that process wasn't used on a whole lot of people. They didn't have enough resources. Going back to our previous conversation, they didn't have enough resources to apply that new process to a lot of people at the border. So it didn't have a really big effect. Most people who were not sent back were still put in immigration court proceedings. And so our court case backlog continued to grow. He also created a new expedited process for families that would require that the head of the household be put on essentially house arrest with an ankle bracelet, and that their case of their asylum case would be adjudicated in a rapid manner if they were going to one of several cities that had that set up. That process, called the Family Expedited Removal Management System, or FIRM, was again not really applied. I think it was a few thousand families that were put in that system. Again, small percentage of the whole total number of people arriving. Lastly, he enacted a regulation called the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways Rule that said that if you arrive between ports of entry, you have a higher burden of proof before we will let you apply for asylum. So that rule was put in place, but interestingly enough, they were sued under that rule both by immigration and asylum advocates who said that that contravened the asylum law that we have, and by opponents from Republican governors, including Texas, who said that law was too lenient. That regulation was too lenient. Sorry, it's not a law. The regulation was too lenient. So dueling court cases on that. The Biden administration also created these new parole programs for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, and expanded certain what they call family reunification parole programs. So parole is one of those discretionary authorities in statute that says that somebody who otherwise wouldn't be allowed to come into the United States could be let in for humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. In this case, the Biden administration believed that both were true with regard to many of the migrants who are arriving at the border. And the significant public benefit, especially, was to encourage migrants to not go to the border, but to apply for this parole process. If you have a sponsor in the United States, you have a passport, and you don't have any other criminal background history, you can apply for this in your country, and we can fly you to the United States, and you'll be admitted for 2 years with a parole, which allows for work authorization. And during that time, you can apply for asylum. It's not a direct path to a green card, but that has resulted in significant declines in the numbers of Haitians, for example, going between ports of entry, as well as Nicaraguans and Cubans. We still see large numbers of Venezuelans. And I think a lot of that is because the Venezuelans don't have as many potential sponsors in the United States that are required for that program. Several other reasons, but that's, I think, the primary one. They also created these new safe mobility offices in 4 countries in Latin America that would allow migrants to go online and put in their information and have it screened and kind of be told by a US government or international organization whether or not they might qualify for asylum or some other kind of protection somewhere. Again, trying to, deter migrants, but not really deter so much as divert migrants from going to the border if they can find out this information ahead of time. And I think those are the big programs. The parole programs, though, have also been litigated. There are court cases, again, Republican governors suing to say that he's exceeding the authority by the scope of this, that parole is supposed to be a case by case basis, and yet he's created these new categories of people, and that's going around the criteria that Congress set in statute for who could come into the United States. So I think going back to sort of the topic of this conversation, what authority does a president have to act on his own? The challenge is that the authority that seemingly exists in statute, when it's discretionary and a president uses that discretionary authority in a way that some people don't like, they will be challenged. And so sometimes they'll be challenged in court, other times they'll be challenged politically. And I think that's what we're seeing. We saw that with Remain in Mexico and Title 42 on the Trump administration. We've seen it with pretty much everything the Biden administration has tried to do now. And I think that does create limits on what the president can actually do.
Yeah, so it sounds like President Biden has tried quite a few things here. Is there more that he can do, or has he exhausted every avenue here?
Well, I'll put it this way. There may be corners of the immigration law that I'm sure his attorneys are scouring right now to see if there's other things that he can do. But I think there are limitations, and some of those limitations we've already talked about. Some of them are foreign policy limitations. If what he tries to do requires cooperation of another government, he has to get that other government to agree. And if they don't want to, there's not much he can do. If there's something that he wants to do that he doesn't have the resources to do, and Congress won't give him the resources to do it, then he can't do it. Whether or not he has the authority is irrelevant. He doesn't have the ability to do it. So there's what you can do and then what you're able to do. Like what you have the authority to do and what you're able to do might be two different things. So I think those are big limitations on what an executive can do that people maybe aren't really cognizant of. And I think the last thing we have to understand is just what the border is in reality, right? A lot of people imagine our borders as somehow impenetrable barriers, right? We can build a wall right on the border. And when we do that, no one can come in. But that's never been the case anywhere. There's never been an impenetrable border, particularly our borders with Canada, and especially with Canada, but even with Mexico, have always been permeable because we've never truly seen it as this place where we have to absolutely prevent everybody from coming in. That's been a recent phenomenon. For almost the first 2 centuries of existence, we really didn't enforce that border for immigration purposes. The Border Patrol was created in 1924, and its principal objective then was to prevent Chinese nationals who were not allowed to come into the United States from going to Mexico and sneaking up. It wasn't really about enforcing against Mexicans. And, it was only really in the second half of the 20th century that we really started focusing on reducing illegal crossings at the border. And we try to do this by deterrence and impedance, which are the terms that Border Patrol uses. So we started building barriers and we started having penalties for people that crossed, none of which zeroed out migration at the border. It's never been zero. And I don't think it can be, in part because part of the border is a river, and the border is actually in the center of the river. And the river is a waterway that is used by both countries for water access, for commercial use, for recreational use. We have treaties with Mexico that say we have to allow this. So there's a litigation right now over barriers that Texas put in the middle of the border that the federal government is saying you can't do that because you're violating our international treaty with Mexico by what you did. So you can't do that. You don't have the authority to do that. Other places along the border are steep canyons and giant mountains, and building like impenetrable barriers there is really engineeringly terribly difficult. Some of the walls that were built under the Trump administration are already starting to teeter because the foundations are in soil that doesn't want to hold a wall that big. There's all kinds of engineering reasons. There's international treaty reasons. And the barriers that we build are all on our side because in order to build a fence or wall, you almost always have to be on both sides of it. And Mexico will say it's a violation of their sovereignty for us to put our construction equipment on their side of the border. So they won't let us do it. So even somebody who's on the opposite side, the Mexico side of the fence, is still in U.S. territory because they've already crossed the border. So, like, these things mean that you're in our territory, you're our responsibility legally, and you're no longer Mexico's responsibility legally because you have left their territory and entered ours. So, like, the reality of the border is a lot more complicated, and the operational realities along the border are a lot more complicated than I think a lot of people want to recognize. That's not to say that we shouldn't do what we can to secure our border, but what does secure mean? It's not like locking up your house. It is more like making sure we have the best idea that we can of what's happening there, that we prevent, criminals and terrorists and smugglers from doing business across the border as best we can, that we manage migration in a way that promotes legality as much as we can. But we also have to recognize there's no police agency anywhere in the world that has a zero crime statistic, right? As long as there are desperate people willing to do desperate things, they're going to try. And that means, we have to have an expectation of managing it best we can. But I think, saying it's going to be zero is asking too much.
Yeah, and as you say, Teresa, this is so complex, and people don't realize just how complex it is. So I know you were on Katie Couric's show last week, and um, I think Katie herself was quite surprised at just how complex and how many different things there were to consider here.
Mhm.
And I'm looking at the YouTube video that was uploaded, and I'd recommend all the listeners to check it out. A lot of the commenters are like, "Wow, this issue is so much more complex than I realized." So that's why it's great to have you explain it to us. Um,
Well, I'm glad I can.
yeah, and my final question here, and I know this is going to make you tear your hair out because you're asked it quite frequently by reporters, and we've heard the claim that Biden can shut down the border. Can you tell us, is that true?
Um, if what you mean by shutting down the border is hermetically sealing the border so that nothing can get through, the answer is no. Certainly not with the resources available to him, but probably also not with the authorities that he has. So, it's worth saying that President Trump used one of those discretionary powers in immigration law called 212F to prevent entry of certain people that he thought would be threats to the United States. We all remember the so-called Muslim ban or the transit ban and various other things that he issued under that authority that ultimately were upheld by the Supreme Court that said that's a pretty broad discretionary authority. And so now, Republicans are arguing that, Biden can just use that authority to shut down the border. What it says is you can prevent the entry of somebody as an immigrant or non-immigrant. Those are two really particular terms in immigration law, and they apply to somebody who is admitted under one of the categories that exist in statute. So the authority actually says we can not admit somebody in one of those legal categories. When you're talking about people who've already crossed the border illegally, or have already arrived in the United States and aren't asking to be admitted as a non-immigrant or an immigrant, but are asking for asylum under a separate provision of law, it's unclear that particular section 212F would apply. As a matter of fact, when Trump tried to do that at the border, he was sued, and at least one court in California said, no, you can't interpret that section that way. Now, that case would have been appealed, but again, the Biden administration took down the order that did that, and so that case kind of was rendered moot and ended. But certainly, if the President Biden were to try it again, I'm sure. Well, we've already heard from representatives of the ACLU; they would immediately reenact that litigation and sue again. And so, I think the courts would then have to decide whether or not that section could be applied, not to shut the border per se, but specifically to deny people the ability to ask for asylum. And I think when President Biden said, look, if you pass this law, I'll immediately shut down the border, what I think he was trying to say is, I would stop processing asylum seekers for now until we can get a handle on things. And I think that's really what this debate is about. We have seen so many people, 3 million in in the last 2 years, 8 million admissions over the last, 5 years that people are going, when is it going to stop? Right? There's this sense of like, we have no control over this. And that sense of loss of control is one of the things that the public really believes our government needs to try to get a handle on. And so you said at the top of this segment, the public says that immigration is their number one issue right now. Why is that? Well, it becomes the number one issue when they feel like nobody's fixing it, right? It just keeps getting worse and worse, and there doesn't seem to be any end to this. But, a couple things that I would just say to that. One is that, look, we've had presidents of both parties try to handle this, and neither has really successfully done so. It's certainly been a lot higher under the Biden administration than it was under Trump. But some of those things were conditions that Trump didn't have that Biden did, such as the arrival of people from lots of countries that we can't send them back to. And I think Trump would have difficulty sending people back to those countries also. We also have had a situation where Mexico has said, we're not going to keep taking people back. And so some of those provisions aren't going to work. We've had so many people arrive that we're just nowhere near the resources needed to process them. So I think that the challenges are likely to remain, and there's no quick fix. I think that's sort of my biggest message to anybody who's looking at this. This has been a situation that has been developing for 10 years. What we have seen over the last 10 years is an absolute paradigm shift in what our immigration system at the US-Mexico border is. And the strategies and infrastructure and processes and laws that we had in place for that previous era no longer really apply and will work in the current era. And we need some new ideas, and we need new thoughts about how to do that. And we need Congress to enact them, because that's how it's going to be implemented over time. But any changes that are passed today will take probably years to fully be implemented and fully see changes. And that's very frustrating when you see a situation that seems like it's just overwhelming. And we know that there's not just, if we just did X, it would all go away. I think we have to be realistic that that's not going to happen. And so what can we do now to get to that point as soon as possible when we have a handle on it again? But continuing to argue about it and fight about it is not getting us any closer to solutions.
Yeah, well, it's a really complex topic, but that's why we have experts like you to break it down for us. Thanks for taking us through that, Theresa.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.